When it comes to East Asia, we've already talked about its unique cultural traditions, namely in the form of Confucianism and Taoism. As it spreads, Buddhism will play a large role in China as well, but that's a topic for a different episode. Today, we're dealing with the structure of the Middle Kingdom, the colossus of the world in terms of trade, cultural and artistic production, and organization, namely China's Tang and Song dynasties. So, what made China so great? First, let's talk about their government. One of the most important things to keep in mind as we move through the year is the idea of state formation. A state is a politically organized territory ruled by a sovereign or independent government. This is different from how you or I think about a country today. Using the word state means that you're referring to a place that has a government without any of the cultural baggage or heritage even that we put on the word country or nation. In this sense, we have to think about how states are formed and how they're organized and maintained. For example, how do you convince people who've hardly been miles away from their village or who sail around oceans that you govern them and that you deserve to govern them? How do you maintain that control once you've achieved it? These are essential questions for the whole year, really. So let's talk about how China during the Tang and Song dynasties does that. In a previous dynasty, so the word dynasty, let's talk about that. It's a family that rules for multiple generations. A system called a bureaucracy developed. A bureaucracy, another important word, is a system where the government creates organizations in order to administer different aspects of that government. So think tax collectors, judges, a treasury, an army, standardizing weights and measures, all that kind of stuff. In China, they had an extremely well-organized bureaucracy divided into 6 different ministries, all overseen by a central censorate, or a governing body that made sure public officials were competent and moral. In order to find all these public officials, China had to develop a training and examination system that was supposed to encourage men of merit and not necessarily just high birth to get these good jobs. In reality, the studying of the Confucian classics required to pass the examinations was something only the privileged had the time or money to do, but it remained a nice idea. Not only was Confucianism the basis of the exams that possible government officials had to take in order to get job assignments, but the very beliefs and practices of Confucianism helped to support the Chinese system. By being strictly hierarchical, the status quo of who was in charge and how you acted to those below and above you in the hierarchy was strictly ingrained into Chinese life. The emperor was your father figure, and you owed him respect in the form of filial piety. You would never question him. Therefore, you would never question his system, his officials, and your place in that system. A recipe for stability that will last 2,000 years. This flowering of a stable government was supported by other developments occurring in China at the same time. Looking at the backdrop of events is often called contextualizing in world history. The cultural and political achievements of China's well-oiled machine existed only because China's economy was experiencing a revolution of its own. Not only was China the most populous and urbanized region in the world, but it also contained the best technology. China had been gifted a unique and fast-growing strain of rice from Vietnam called Champa rice that enabled even the poorest families to feed their children, hence their massive population growth and increased urbanization. Because the rice grew so well and so quickly, fewer people needed to grow it, and so that freed up population to go work in cities and manufacturing. Iron production reached almost industrial revolution levels, with enough armor and weaponry to furnish a large army and build architectural marvels. Gunpowder was weaponized and produced in large quantities. The printing press allowed for dissemination of literature, and a new class of scholar gentry, the literati of the court, was born. Seeing the perfect man as someone educated, decisive, masculine, but yet poetic and artistic. China was the center of its own and world trade. When we think about Columbus in a few units and why he wanted to get to Asia so badly, this is where it starts. Chinese production was so efficient and effective that goods and products were made for markets, stores, and overseas shipping. In order to make trade more and more efficient, paper money was invented so merchants, who were very low on the Confucian hierarchy, by the way, didn't have to lug around heavy coinage. Not all was rainbows and trade surpluses, though. Women in China were not really having a good time. If you were a peasant woman, your life remained the same as it had always been and always would be, working alongside your husband in the fields or in the store, trying to make sure that you could just feed your children. If you were an aristocratic or noble woman, however, life was not super great. In world history, whenever there are periods of economic prosperity, we see an interesting trend of restricting women's bodies in order to show status and their removal from the workforce. In Song China, that is evidenced by the practice of foot binding. When she was a little girl, an aristocratic woman's mother would ritualistically break and bind the toes under the sole of her foot, wrapping it up that way so that it healed, curled underneath itself. This would create supposedly a foot that looked like a flower petal, but really was just the restriction of women's bodies. The maimed feet would make women take tiny, delicate little steps, which were seen as ladylike and feminine when she could walk at all. For longer distances, she would have to be carried in a litter, which is a very outward display of status and privilege. In reality, she can't work, she can't escape, and she is physically detached from her lower class sisters, whose feet remained obviously unbound. This strict maintenance of cultural, economic, and political life in Tang and Song China is what enabled it to thrive as much as the rest of the world struggled through economic and environmental troubles.